it is important for states, for Europe, to have its own way of creating models and of shaping models with their own values, for sure. The approach that we've taken is also quite rebellious in that we're promoting a decentralized way of creating the technology, which is to bring open weight models to the world and make sure that everybody can actually contribute and make it their own. The successful brain of tomorrow is going to be more creative. And so we need to promote more creativity in all of the curriculums that we are creating. The biggest impact we can have is in turning enterprises and states into leaders in adopting artificial intelligence and making their business competitive.
Welcome to the 33rd episode of Innovative Greeks. We have the great pleasure today of hosting, as my dad would say, a remarkable young man. He's only 33 years old. He has achieved incredible things so far. Arthur Mensch, the founder and CEO of Mistral. So Arthur, it's a real pleasure hosting you here. And before we start, I have to thank the ambassador for the very kind offer to hold this discussion in this lovely embassy. So Arthur, with no further ado, I know you've had a very busy day already. You're going to have a more busy day ahead. I'd like to take things from the beginning, right? There are a lot of young people watching these conversations, wondering, what they should study. And I guess my first question is, when did you first develop an interest in science?
Well, I guess it dates probably when I was 6 or 7. Or my mother is actually a physics teacher, and my father is a computer scientist. So I had the chance to grow up in a family which was a scientist family. So I've been interested in science from the very beginning of my life.
And looking at either École Polytechnique or then later, INRA or NYU, you have a very interesting mix of most AI people are computer science, math. You've gone into the way the brain works, biology, neuroscience as well.
Indeed, I'm much more of a computer scientist and did much more mathematics than neuroscience in my studies. But I should say, when I was out of École Polytechnique and I was looking at a way to deploy machine learning, it was the name of artificial intelligence at the time, into concrete applications. And one of the applications that was of interest to me was to do brain scanning. So use unsupervised techniques, so to decompose the brain into certain parts. So you just put people in scanners and you make them do nothing for 15 minutes, and they tend to get asleep in general. And then you look at what their brain is doing as you do that experiment, and you do it for thousands of people. And thanks to that information, you can actually decompose the different functions of the brain, and then that can be used as biomarkers for detecting certain diseases and these kind of things. So it's one of the domain where you have a very strong application, both on the science side and also on the clinical side, and where the mathematical problem of scale was very interesting. So that's how I got started, and then pretty quickly I moved toward doing more natural language processing aspects, etc. So to me, science is only useful when you have outcomes, and it's also the case at Mistral as well. We build models, but more importantly, perhaps we actually turn them into business outcomes. And that's how I thought about starting my PhD, and I think that's how it's a good way of thinking about where to start a PhD.
In fact, when Demis Hassabis visited Athens over the summer, he got this question, what amazes you most? And he said, actually, you would assume it would be the leaps in AI, but in fact, what amazes me most is how the brain actually operates, the human brain. And that is still the greatest mystery. So that was an interesting answer.
Well, it is. What's interesting, and I know Demis, he has been my employer for a couple of years. And what's interesting is that we are building a different kind of intelligence, in that we are nowhere near understanding how the brain functions and how we function. But on the other hand, we have kind of started a parallel intelligence, which is the silicon intelligence, which is compressing human knowledge. And so we start from human intelligence because at the end, the input to our models is are really produced by humans. But then we turn it into something which is much better than humans at certain domains, but much worse at others. And so that's interesting in that, and I would assume what's interesting is that if you make the hypothesis that there's other kind of biological intelligence out there in the world, which is probably true, it's very probable that they came up with their own way of creating another kind of silicon intelligence. And so that's, from a philosophical perspective, this is quite interesting to think about.
Let me ask you a question that I think is on a lot of people's minds, both philosophically but also geopolitically. You know, in humankind, the parent matters and the teachers matter, right, a lot. Maybe there's a debate about nature and nurture. Some of what we are is DNA, some of it is how we were brought up. How applicable is this to models? Do you ascribe a lot of importance as to who is the patrimony or matrimony of the model, whether it's an American or Chinese or European?
It matters in multiple ways. If you look at the model itself, models are predictor of words. They take context and then they predict words that you can then turn into orchestration or that you can turn into images if you want. The way they're predictors, and so they need to be trained in a certain way. So the first thing you do is you compress a certain kind of human knowledge. Then you need to pick that human knowledge. Then the second thing you do is that you give them some demonstration of actual humans doing certain tasks in a certain way. And then the third thing you do is that you ask humans to compare in between multiple outputs of the models. So at every of these stages, you're making conscious choices as an AI scientist of what knowledge to put into the model, how to guide it into certain directions, what kind of preference do you want to distill into the models. And so those are editorial choices. This is not, there's no universal reason why you would prefer a certain way of answering a question to another. There's no reason why there are multiple questions where you need to make some form of editorial choice. It's not easy to, for instance, retain political neutrality. So the way to think about it is really, it's almost a journalist job to actually take the model and take it into certain directions. At Mistral, we call them AI trainers, and they tend to be journalists, actually. We hire journalists to guide the model into certain directions. And so, of course, the trainers matter very much. The technology does matter, optimizing model weights so that they produce the right content matters. But what matters most is the data, and the data is picked by humans. So that's very much true. And so just looking at the model itself, it's culturally shaping. So those are content-producing machines. They are also guiding the way we actually access information. More and more, you access information through conversational assistants. And because of that, it matters to have a diversity of providers. Because if you only have a few providers, maybe one or two, suddenly they have a lot of power in shaping the content that everybody is going to read. So focusing purely on the model, and I'm not talking about the deployment and the adaptation to enterprise needs, etc. There's a strong sovereignty aspect there. There's a strong cultural sovereignty aspect. It is important for states, for Europe, to have its own way of creating models and of shaping models with their own values, for sure.
Having said that, Mistral, I think, has succeeded on one level, especially in Europe, in having a very strong brand name very soon. Now, there's certainly an emotional aspect to that, a sense of security, that it is European. Your name, Mistral, I was curious. I know it's the northwestern wind in Provence, and in Greece we call it maestros. It's the equivalent northwestern wind, which is actually quite nice for people who sail. Is it also a reference to Frédéric Mistral, the Nobel winner, or not really?
Well, it was 2023. We were looking for a name. It's actually a hard thing to do, to look for a name. And Timothée came up with Mistral. Timothée, he lives in the south of France, so that's probably why he was sensitive to it. In Mistral, it turns out you have two vowels, which are I and A, and in French, artificial intelligence is named intelligence artificielle. And so that's the I and A of Mistral. That's kind of the inside point of view that we give on the name finding. Really, it was just sounding right, and there was no copyright on it.
I can tell you it's a reassuring name for most people. It's a lovely wind. Now, I guess, my next question is, in terms of making that decision to leave DeepMind at a very young age. I mean, you were 31, in 23 to start Mistral. That, brave choice, leaving one of the most desirable companies in the world right now, and I think also ethically respected, which is important. What was your motivation in making that brave decision?
Well, the motivation was at an institutional level. We realized with Guillaume and Timothée that there was a need for a European champion, and that was not a technology that we had to give it a try. In that this was a technology we knew how to build. This was a technology that was going to drive the next industrial revolution, and that if you were to extrapolate the path it was taking, looked like Europe would not have a say to it. And so our point of view there has been to say Europe needs a champion. We also need a global champion, which is promoting a different way of building frontier AI intelligence. And that way has been through openness, we've been leader in bringing open source models to the world so that enterprises could customize them to their needs, so that companies that needed to have strong control over their data flows, etc., could deploy them on their own. So we had these really 2 points of view. First of all, it was technological, that we strongly believe that artificial intelligence systems will be built on top of an open source foundation in the years to come, and we wanted to be the leader in that. And the second aspect was around the fact that we could get 15 people that were AI scientists in Paris, and that we could take to bring quickly models to the market, and that if we were not to do it, nobody would do it, and then it would be too late. So that was how we thought about the opportunity of creating the company. And of course, it's less comfortable to build a company than to be an AI scientist at DeepMind. I'd say it's not that risky in that we were able to raise money quickly. We were confident in that, in our ability to deliver. We had no idea of what was ahead of us, of course. You don't know when you start a company that suddenly, or 3 years in, your company is going to be 500 people, and then you have a lot of new challenges to deal with. We had no idea how to build a business. The only thing we knew how to do was to build models. But then it's the greatest learning experience. Certainly, you need to figure out things by yourself, and you don't have a lot of people to rely on. That you have investors, etc., but they're trusting you. So you're trusted by multiple people at the same time, and so you have a lot of weight on your shoulder. But then you also have much more agency, and you can learn very fast. So to me, it's been the great experience. I wouldn't trade it for any other role in any company.
And it's interesting that you gave birth twice in a way. You Mistral, and then you have your first child that was born quite recently, I understand.
Yeah. Similarly timed
So you're
projects.
doing these at the same time. How's that working out?
Yeah, and my daughter was born 9 months after Mistral creation, so it was very much like a similarly timed project. It takes the rest of my time, I'd say, but it's delightful to see the 2 baby growth.
Well, you're still looking good, so you must be doing something right. I hear you cycle, you run.
I have a great team. They are there actually, who are very efficient and much greater people than I am in multiple parts of the businesses. So grateful to have leverage and having been able to hire great people. That's the key to, and then running a little bit to keep in good health, indeed.
Of course. Now, some people, and we discussed this before, some people see you as a rebellious force, Mistral. In what sense? They hope that you can do for AI and for AI models what Linux did for operating systems. And I think for a lot of people this is important because Linux stands for transparency and openness. It stands for customization and control of the user versus someone hijacking your knowledge and your IP. And then finally, of course, going against the giants. right, which are mostly American and Chinese. Do you feel a rebellious streak in what you guys are doing? How does your team feel about this endeavor?
No, I mean, of course, the rebellious aspect of it is high. We left the incumbents to create a company that would compete with them and steal a part of their markets. So there is inherently in the construction of Mistral, there was a rebellious part to it. Now, the approach that we've taken is also quite rebellious in that we're promoting a decentralized way of creating the technology, which is to bring open weight models to the world and make sure that everybody can actually contribute and make it their own. We think it's important because that's a way to avoid having a single or two companies having too much leverage on content creation and on operating the entire economy. It also means that we had to build a different business model because our business model is much more downstream creation of value than centralized control of the platform itself. So we build models, but then we help companies deploy these models and we help companies customize those models to their needs. And it's very much a way to also put the incumbents under pressure because their positioning is, of course, to say, we're building a model that nobody can compete with us because we build the best models on earth and we're going to be basically the winner take all in that market. And our play has been to show that there won't be winner takes all in that market because we've been able to be always around 3-4 months either ahead or behind of the competition with open source with open source technology. And so it's going to, of course, the story isn't fully written yet, and the jury is still out on who is going to be successful or not. We think there will be centralized model provider and decentralized model providers down the line for different kind of applications. But I think we stand for an alternative, and we think we need an alternative in Europe, in particular, and everywhere on earth. We think enterprises should look at alternatives when it comes to their AI digital services provider, because down the line they will need leverage. You can't afford to run your company on a single AI provider who is going to try and extract value if they can.
I think your timing in terms of how things have even changed since 23 has been good, in the sense that I think geopolitics and sovereignty have come into the fore much more strongly. Therefore, the whole issue about having control is important, and it didn't used to be. And I think the other thing that's moving in your favor is a lot of people are talking about an AI bubble, too much expenditure on capital and on sort of capital expenditure on infrastructure as opposed to optimizing models, right? And in that sense, I'd like you to talk a bit about your almost obsession with value. Because when you ask people, okay, analysts in Goldman Sachs or wherever, what could go wrong? How could the bubble burst? Usually what they say is, well, you know, AI has a promise. The large American companies are making tremendous investments in infrastructure. And if certain clients over the next 2 years are not getting the value they expected from AI, you know, that bubble could easily not burst, but probably deflate. You guys are very focused on creating value per company, being with the companies, you know, helping them extract that value maybe more patiently. Plus, you're not spending as much as the Americans, which helps.
Absolutely.
So can you talk to us about this a bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a learning process for us. When we started, the only thing we knew how to do was models. And so we didn't really know how to turn like a technology really into something that would be outcomes for enterprises. And what we did is to start with design partners and look at their problems and look at how generative AI could be used to solve it. And we realized that, first of all, they needed more tooling. So they needed more inference, tooling for inference, tooling for training, tooling for orchestrating, connecting AI models to their data and to their content, and tooling to actually operate, so run workflows, connect workflows to AI agents and these kind of things. So we've built the orchestration, really the orchestration layer and the inference layer on top of the models that we initially knew how to do. And then what we also realized is that enterprises needed a little nudge, in that the problem of building new software and new applications with AI models is that this is a different kind of software engineering. You need to think about data much more. You need to think about iterations. These are organic systems. They behave like humans, more or less, the AI models. So you need to treat them as such. So you need to train them. You need to every month do an iteration on handling the edge cases of the process that the AI is running and turning the next generation, the next iteration into something that has less edge cases. And so the practice we've built and the product we've built is centered around going from outcomes back to how the technology is going to address it. And we've found that combining products, so from model to front-end layers and to back-end orchestration layers, with experts, so AI forward deployment engineers or forward deployment scientists that have PhDs and that can actually think about what kind of new model to create based on the problem. We found that this combination was needed to get enterprises to value. Because otherwise they would oftentimes stop short of moving into production. We would build a lot of prototype, but then there's a growing frustration from enterprise leaders that they've been told about generative AI being a revolution for the last 3 years, but then they don't see anything on the balance sheet. They don't see anything on the top line. They don't see too much on the bottom line. And so we want to help them change that. And we think that if we don't change that fast enough, there is a risk that suddenly there's a realization that the investment that have been made are too high. And so that's how we balance also the investment. So we invest a lot. We've just raised 1.7 billion euro with the like of ASML, which is one of our big customers. So we invest on making models better, but we also invest a lot on making enterprises successful. And that's our way of trying to solve the disconnect that we see in certain there is a disconnect in certain markets.
Was it a conscious choice to choose a European investor like ASML as opposed to maybe a global investor? I know you started with American VCs, but obviously at this stage the money is much, much greater in terms of absolute amounts.
I mean, we chose to partner with ASML because we believe in AI accelerating technological progress. I think that's the next frontier is bringing AI to every engineer, not only the software engineers, but making sure that when they need to build a new product, when they need to solve a new problem, when they need to make the system handle heat better, for instance, or when they need to make more precise lithography, they actually use AI systems to help them. And so we are very much aligned with ASML there, and they own a lot of IP, a lot of vertical knowledge that can be distilled into AI systems, and we help them with that. Now, of course, it's a European champion. There are many European champions, but it's one of them. And so it was very natural for us to partner with them. If you look at our fundraisers, we did 4. We've always tried to put Europe as high as possible. Depending on our Series A, for instance, was mostly US because it was very early. Our Series B had much more European, and our Series C was mostly European. So if you can show the value, and if you can show that you're actually creating a sustainable business, you can actually get European capital. If you're a bit too early, and if you're asking for a lot of money with a large promise, and usually European investors are a little more risk-averse than US investors, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, this I'd like your perspective on this. ASML is the largest group, European tech company at 340 billion. I think SAP is second with 200 and something. This is like 10 times smaller than the trillion-dollar companies in the US these days. And, this rift really happened very intensely in the past 15 years. Like in 2010, Europe and the US had the same GDP per capita, and now these guys are 1.5 times bigger than us. Why do you think this happened? And what should we correct going forward?
Well, I think we missed the boat on creating ads business, which have been creating a lot of value for certain US enterprises. I think we suffered a lot from having we have a younger startup ecosystem. And all of the work that the US has done from the 60s of investing actually public money into innovation and startups and of investing private money as well has paid off because there was layers and layers of startups that eventually created businesses that were enormous because they were ads business, which are high margin businesses. We weren't there. We for multiple reasons, we did not invest enough in innovation and technology starting from the 70s. I think we're getting there. We're getting there in terms of directing public sector demand toward European technology, which has made the success of US tech sector. We're getting there in terms of creating the solidarity across the value chain of European companies working with European technology providers. And I think we'll get there. The challenge we have is that the US created US technology without a foreign competitor that would try to steal its market at every place. And so the challenge we have here is that, of course, we'll be competing with more mature companies coming from the US sometimes. And sometimes it takes a deliberate choice, a long-term choice coming from either the States or from companies to work with a European partner, because down the line they will create more value for them, and down the line it's better for the ecosystem. But I think the only problem is that we have 40 years we started 40 years later, but I think we've gone much faster and we're catching up, and I'm very optimistic about the fact that we'll build much bigger companies in the future.
I think you make a good point here, because a lot of people don't realize that 70% of US venture capital money is coming from pension funds. You know, most people in Europe think that it's all coming from places other than public. But in reality, you're very right. You know, the US has supported its ecosystem through public funds as well, for sure. And Europe has not.
You have pension funds, and for sure. And I think it might have been a bad choice in 45 to choose to go through a different kind of pension system, which is not a capitalization system. The advantage of capitalization systems is that you're basically incentivizing people to invest over 40 years. And so the consequence of that is that they invested in technology. And to be honest, we couldn't foresee that. It was, if you look at our great-grandfathers, my great-grandfathers couldn't think about it, I think. It's probably time to revert, and we can still continue to have like a social repartition system, but still make sure that we invest more public money into AI technology and into technology in general. The other lever that the US has used very well is not an investment lever, it's a demand lever. It's the fact that DARPA invested and booked a lot of European technology, and still is doing a lot of public money is flowing as in bookings into US technology. And I think something we haven't done well in Europe is to figure out that we should channel public spending towards demand for technology companies.
I completely agree with you. I mean, most people don't know that things like we use every day, like Waze, was actually developed in DARPA.
Exactly.
You know, people don't. So I agree with you. My next question is you know, you have said three things that I find resonate with me. You said, you know, the main barriers to creating a successful European AI ecosystem are really capital, talent, and data. And in a way, capital is the least scarce at the moment. I think talent and data is getting more and more scarce. And my question to you is, you have successfully managed to get people from Meta, from DeepMind, from Google, from various places to come work for Mistral. And it can't be the money alone. It has to be something more than that. What is it? What is it that makes a level 7, say, you know, engineer leave one of those super big players and come to you guys?
I think it's the mission and it's the culture. It's the mission because, well, you just have a lot of people in US technology companies that are looking at an excuse for working with a European company, and so we've managed to get a few of them. It's not the reason why US designers, for instance, are joining us. They're also joining us because the mission we have, the global mission we have of bringing Frontier AI into everyone's hands in a more decentralized way, is also resonating whatever the nationality of people. So the mission is important, and then the culture, I think, is important. It's important to retain people. They are joining us because they know that they're going to have a lot of autonomy. As scientists, they will have a lot of exposure to the business. We have a strong transparency culture, so as in any place in the company, you can see what's happening around you, and so you can understand, and you feel much more in the midst of it than if you are in the big tech where you're in general in a silo where you don't actually see why strategic decisions are made. And so we expose everyone to strategic decisions and to debates. I think that matters. And then in general, the approach we've taken, of course, you need these level 7 people to come in and to bring some of their knowledge, etc. But the strength of Europe, and that applies basically in every capital, in every state, is that we have strong junior talent. So people coming out of universities. We have the best universities in the world in computer science and in mathematics. The one thing to figure out is to make sure that these people, these students, are working for a European company instead of going to the US. And so reversing the brain drain has been critical, I think, to our success. We've been I think the median age at Mistral is like 26 or something. So those are young people and very, very dynamic. And we hire them in many places in Europe. So we hire them in Paris, in Warsaw, in Munich, in London. We're looking at hiring people here.
I hope so soon.
Indeed.
Bear in mind, Arthur, that Greece has the 6th highest per capita percentage of graduates in the STEM fields in the world. We're up there with Korea and Taiwan. So it's, you have a steady flow of very good talent. As you say, the problem until recently was that they went straight to the States. We lost them as a continent, but also as a country.
But if you give them alternatives, if you tell a graduate master student that he can work or she can work in a company that is state-of-the-art on technology, that is building a business and where the headquarters is going to be 1 hour away in terms of time zone, or if you tell them that you're going to be working on the headquarters while staying in Europe, they stay. Because in general, well, it's Europeans, they want to stay. Everyone wants to stay with friends and family. And so if you provide them with the right alternative, the right compensation, and the right mission, they stay, and they are very happy to stay there, and you have a higher retention rate. So that's the strategy we've been following. Just provide something attractive and they will stay.
I think you have a point. I mean, I was recently talking to a founder that has moved back from the US here, and he said to me, there's no doubt that the US has been a fantastically successful experiment economically, but not so successful socially, which means that the quality of life and living there is becoming more polarized, more difficult. And Europe obviously is still a nice place to live and work,
Well, it's a great place to live and work. You have a lot of diversity of thoughts. It's a different lifestyle, and I think a lot of people in Europe at Mistral embrace that lifestyle, and they like the culture that we have promoted. We still have like a quarter of the workforce is actually in the US, so I think we've been able to bridge the two cultures in a successful way. We still have to invest there, but as people want to work with mission-driven companies in places where in the places where they grew up. That's the realization we made in the last 2 years.
Yeah, for guys like me that grew into a culture that globalization would be it. Now, things I think are getting more local again, and sovereignty is coming up, and belonging is coming up, and things like that. So, in that spirit, I would like to ask you, in 5 years from now, if you were to say one thing that Mistral could change in Europe, the impact of Mistral, of this project, what would it be?
Well, to me, the biggest impact we can have is in turning enterprises and states into leaders in adopting artificial intelligence and making their business competitive. Because down the line, what matters is not really what we do, it's what our customers do. Whether they're able to pick AI and pick artificial intelligence as a lever to become more dominant in their field, as a lever to become a thought leader in making citizens access artificial intelligence, if you look at public sector adoption. And so there are many champions in all industrial verticals in Europe, and if we can make them successful at competing with China, which has a lot of structural advantages when it comes to the cost of labor, a lot of structural advantage when it comes to the vertical integration, then that would be a success. And so we want to be the enabler. We want to make sure that public sector adopt technology faster. We want to make sure that enterprises we work with are the fastest at adopting AI and therefore at competing with their on their field. And then the third thing is really sovereignty. We want in 5 years' time, we can't have defense systems, the next generation defense systems, which are really going to be the deterrence of tomorrow. They need to be operated from Europe because otherwise we'll be in an even dire situation than the one we are in today. And so that's an area where we're investing because we think that for democracies, this is an area to own.
I'd like your perspective. I've read that Yann LeCun from Meta said that he doesn't believe that the road to general intelligence will be via LLMs. Do you have an opinion on this, like your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, LLMs are sequence-to-sequence generators. So at the end, like from a pure mathematical perspective, you give them a sequence of numbers that generate a sequence of numbers. Turns out that this is a fairly generic abstraction in that you can solve a lot of problems by generating sequence of numbers. And so these sequence-to-sequence generators are always going to be a core aspect of any artificial intelligence systems you do. In particular because they're also co-adapted to the hardware that we are deploying them on. So this adaptation is going to be very hard to challenge. On the other hand, a lot of the alpha and science that is currently being made is around everything that is sitting on top. So how do you turn that sequence-to-sequence generator into something that can operate complex systems with like multiple tools to be called, where you need to create some state and memorization, where you need to go and figure out the mess that is always the IT of an enterprise. And so there are a lot of unlocks to be found. I think we've made great progress in making harnesses, so orchestration layers that are more intelligent, that are more stateful, so that use goals, that use memory to drive things forward. But I think on the modeling side, I think we have what we need. Now, the only thing that matters is to get the right data to feed the model with.
And just a final sort of area that I'd like us to explore, which is, I guess, the area of ethics. You know, I think Europe has a higher, I'd say, sensitivity to ethics than other parts in the world. And also in the sense of labor, right? I mean, Europe has the most advanced welfare state. If you were to say one thing about post-war Europe that no other place in the world has, is we take care of our own, literally, like the least capable, the least fortunate. If you listen to some of the more cynical Silicon Valley investors in AI, they'll say, look, it's nothing like SaaS. SaaS made processes better. This thing is going to replace people. So it's going to actually impact labor cost, which is why it's going to have a massive multiple and why it's okay to invest in companies at those valuations, because obviously the impact is much larger than ever before. The flip side of that is it may impact the labor market in a big way. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it will impact the labor market for sure. There's a reskilling endeavor to be taken as soon as possible by enterprises and by states, by universities. The kind of skills that you need to learn today are very different from the kind of skills I learned, and I was a student 10 years ago. In that, a lot of the nitty-gritty aspect of the computer science, for instance, are getting abstracted away because you can actually generate the code. So it's just one example. There are a lot of tasks where the AI can solve it, and that means that humans need to bring another value add to it. What's interesting is that this is kind of shifting the skills that we're looking for. Historically, we've been promoting people with a very strong synthesis mind, an ability to synthesize information and to take decisions quickly. Turns out that artificial intelligence is good at that. And synthesizing information is the bread and butter of these systems. So what that means is that I think the successful brain of tomorrow is going to be more creative. And so we need to promote more creativity in all of the curriculums that we are creating. We need to promote more creativity in existing workforces. so that they can leverage AI systems and they can bring the human spark to it. And the human spark to it is always going to be there. There's no way in which we replace care. There's no way in which we replace the value of human relationship. And there is hardly a way to replace the creativity as well. So what that means is that we need to shift the curriculums we have. We need enterprises to rethink about the skill sets of their labor. And then we need to think about protection. Because it is happening too fast for certain people to retrain. And so they will need to have some form of buffer to retrain and to take jobs that are going to be valuable in the new AI economy. So we need to think about social protection as something that we've successfully figured out in Europe in the last 50 years. But that's something that needs to evolve because effectively, from a macroeconomic perspective, the value creation of capital is becoming higher than is relatively becoming higher than the value creation of labor. And that's the macro shift that we are seeing because of artificial intelligence. This is not going to change. This is not going to happen overnight either. So we have time to figure out the kind of social protection we need to set up. But we need to start having democratic debate on it. And that's for sure. And one thing I would add is that if not only there's two problems we are going to face. First, that there will be a shift toward capital, the value creation of capital, which is already too high, and creating challenges of accruing inequalities and these kind of things. But if we import all of the digital services from foreign entities, then we also have a commercial imbalance problem. And what that means that effectively what we may end up doing is that effectively we're outsourcing a lot of the labors in Europe to the US. And that's not something we want to do. So at least let's keep the value creation of technology in Europe. And then let's think about the fiscality of it, the social structure of it, so that we protect people and make sure that they can retrain, give them time to retrain and to grow the skill set that they need in the AI economy.
Couldn't agree more. I think that, if Europe ends up firing people and outsourcing those jobs to American AI companies, it would be a real disaster. And
it's not socially acceptable.
It's unacceptable. Whereas if it is European companies participating in this process, it means they will retrain people, you create a new generation for sure. So final question is, there are a lot of young Greek founders, or people who are not yet founders, but dream of creating a company like yours, or much smaller as well, who I think would ask you the question, what is the one belief or habit that made the biggest difference for you in your personal journey?
Well, you need to not look too much ahead in the future because you can get afraid of the complexity of it. But I think what we've learned is that you can learn on the fly. You can learn on the job, really. And so you're not taking too much risk by being an entrepreneur. Maybe you will fail one time or multiple times, and we failed multiple times at Mistral. We made a lot of mistakes. But down the line, if you're motivated and if you can get people to believe in you as well, you'll get there. You'll adapt. Just be ready to learn fast. Be ready to realize fast that you're making mistakes. And you'll be all right. And you will learn much faster by being an entrepreneur than by joining a big tech company.
And I always close by this question. What is your happy place? When you're stressed or feeling a bit down, you close your eyes, you think of a place that you love. What is your special place in your mind?
Well, I read a lot of books that are not related to artificial intelligence. I think that's in particular about science in general, and more recently about archaeology and the history of humanity. So how did we, in particular, I'm thinking about how humans adapted to the tools they created and their brain adapted to the tools they created. It turned out that we did adapt our brains to the tools we created. And our morphology actually was adapted to our tooling. We invented fire and then suddenly our teeth actually became less big, and that created more energy for us to grow our brain. So there has been some adaptation there. The question that we have today in artificial intelligence is that this is happening too fast. So we need to figure out as a society how to figure it out, but how to deal with it. But my happy place is to read books that are not related to artificial intelligence.
Wonderful. As Christopher Hitchens said, the greatest miracle of science is that it reveals the fact that there are no miracles, but human self-determination. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was wonderful to talk to you.
Thank you very much.